Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for the latest segment of Effecting Change, EFF's live stream series, where our panelists tackle the latest issues in civil liberties and human rights in technology and the digital world. My name is Rin. I'm the Associate Director of State Affairs at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, and I'll be your host for today's discussion. Before proceeding, we have a few housekeeping items to go over. We will be recording this session, but only a video of our participants, our speakers, will be included. Please do join us now in the official chat via Twitch on eff.org/livestream. You can drop your questions in the chat throughout the program, and our guests will answer as many as they can in the end. And if you're comfortable, we encourage you to type a hello in the chat now to let us know which part of the world you're tuning in from. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Electronic Frontier Foundation, EFF is a nonprofit whose technologists, activists, and attorneys have been fighting for your online privacy and free speech since 1990. You are the reason EFF can take on this important work. So if you'd like to help us in the fight to defend your digital freedoms, please consider donating at eff.org/supportchange or picking up a cool bit of EFF merch at shop.eff.org. And with that, I'd love to welcome our speakers, Alexis, Cynthia, and Hannah. First off, we have Alexis Hancock, who is the EFF Director of Engineering and focuses on expansion of encryption, digital identity, and firmware transparency. Next, we have Cynthia Conti-Cook, who is the Director of Research and Policy at the Collaborative Research Center for Resilience, who focuses on digital public infrastructure, digital identity and wallets, government procurement of technology, and how workers can influence tech procurement in government and their industry. Last but certainly not least, we have Hannah Mimon, who is a software developer at Gen Z for Change and focuses on developing digital advocacy tools for immigration, labor, climate, and reproductive justice campaigns. We'll have about 15 minutes for your questions at the end, so if we haven't touched on something that you want to hear about, please ask by adding them in the chat at any time. So let's get started. So today we're here to discuss age verification or age gating laws, which are laws that generally require websites and apps to check or estimate every user's age before allowing access to certain content or services. These are laws that are often enforced using invasive tools like government ID uploads, biometric scans, or so-called age estimation technologies. Governments in the US and around the world are rapidly adopting these laws in the name of protecting children online. But in practice, they create new systems of surveillance, censorship, and exclusion that affect everyone. In 2025, age verification moved from a fringe policy idea to a widespread reality across the world. Nearly half of the US now mandates age checks for adult content or social media. Congress recently had a hearing dedicated to 19 federal bills on this same issue. And internationally, the UK, Australia, Brazil, and other countries around the world are already implementing age verification mandates. But while these mandates are framed as online safety measures, they do more harm than good. And I'm really excited to have our panel today to discuss these harms and the human harms of these technologies. Because not only do they undermine free expression, they erode privacy and anonymity, they create new barriers to internet access and expose users to serious data security risks. And of course, this will never stop at just adult content. Lawmakers are already proposing invasive age checks and ID checks for everything from social media to dating apps, AI chatbots, and even skincare products or diet supplements. So what begins as an age verification to supposedly protect children online quickly becomes a broad surveillance regime, one that reshapes how people of all ages will experience the internet. So to get us started on this discussion, Alexis, you've worked on age verification and digital ID technologies for a while now. Could you start us off by laying the groundwork of how age gating actually works in practice? And relatedly, do these schemes actually work?
Yes, to be glad to. With age gating, there's various methods that different platforms can adopt, and they have. Usually, age verification methods, or age assurance methods will go through several different ways of verifying your identity or verifying your age, right? So, if you look at it with the framework that they have built They being policymakers who have implemented age verification. It's framed around protecting the children, right? It's framed around keeping children safe online. But when you actually look at the implementation, it's more about platform compliance than it is about actually protecting children or keeping them safe online or even teaching them how to be safe online. So if you look at it from a platform compliance aspect, age gating is more beneficial from that angle than it is with actually setting out to do what the original intention was set out. When you look at different policymakers and how they frame this, it treats the user as a liability. It treats everyone who arrives at the platform as hostile to the platform and possibly a liability depending on their age, not necessarily protecting them because of their age, right? So if you look at it that way, where you're saying, does it protect children? Does it keep them safe online? No, age gating does not do that, but it does help enhance platform compliance and shift liability. So the error margin for whether or not you get denied based off whatever method they use, and most of them have not been proven to be, fully safe or fully private or fully protective of your data. If you look at it from that aspect, error margins are left to the user. So anything that denies you based off of it being wrong, whatever age verification method that they use, whether it be facial estimation, checking your ID, whether it be looking at different parts of your data or your age of your account or inferring your age, whatever method that they use, if it fails, that error margin lands on you as a user and the burden lies on you as the user, and it shifts the liability away from the platform when you are using age gating methods. So framing it that way and looking at how it's been implemented, I see it as less and less about actually protecting the children, keeping them safe online, and more so about shifting blame, liability, and burden.
Yeah, that's such a great point. I want to, Cynthia, ask you. You wrote a great piece for User Mag titled "Who Age Verification Laws Really Benefit and How to Resist," and you describe age verification as a way to legislate morality, which I think is such a great way to put it. Can you unpack what that looks like in practice and who ultimately benefits from these laws and who bears the real cost?
Yes, thank you, Ren, and thank you to EFF for inviting me to join this fantastic panel and important discussion today. Legislating morality was a phrase that I actually first encountered when I sat down for a conference session that was named Legislating Morality, hosted by age verification industry vendors and lobbyists. It was how they presented themselves. It was the promise that they were making and the conversation that they were hoping to start with people who were, many of the people that were at this conference were government actors. And I think that when we sort of take a step back from the very confusing and very intense kind of technology-based conversations of what this is and how it works, and we think about the iterations of censorship that we have observed over the past, even just the past decade, right? The book bans across this country also started with a lot of vocal concerns about sexualized content. But then they expanded to include a lot more kinds of conversations about identity, whether that was identity that is gender, whether it's queer, whether it's based on even erasing entire aspects of our history if they made kids feel uncomfortable. And it was the argument that critical race theory and anything that mentioned slavery or made kids feel bad needed to also be erased. These types of attempts to use the law and use operations through the law to push other people's morality on us all are not new. And they also go back centuries to obscenity laws. And for example, Anthony Comstock famously was a vocal activist for pushing censorship in healthcare and prohibited, for example, the use of media to distribute or inform people about abortion back in the 1800s. And so this is not a new practice. Legislating morality is not a new game or goal from many people who see the opportunity of getting access to the state, whether it is to state laws or whether it is to state operations. And what I think that these technologies really have the potential and the danger to do is import other people's morality without going through public legislative processes, because they are so technically inaccessible as a conversation for many people.
Yeah, that's such a great point. I think also that makes me think of how a lot of these laws in the US have a civil right of action, so that in that way it is legislating other people's morals. If you find something objectionable, you could go ahead and sue a content provider. So that's such a great point. Hannah, I'd love to talk to you a little bit about the work, your work at Gen Z for Change. How have young people actually been included or excluded from conversations about age verification and online safety? And what do these laws mean for LGBTQ youth and for young people seeking information about reproductive or gender affirming care, for example?
Yeah, this is a really big kind of area and point of contention that that differs between young people and the lawmakers behind these sort of age verification policies. I guess to start off, working in the youth and advocacy space online, I see time and time again that young people are often invoked as the reason for these laws, like Alexis mentions, but are rarely a part of the decision-making process and designing and developing them, collaboratively. And in the rare occurrence that does happen, often, those sorts of policies tend to harm and impact, young people in the foster care system, for example, the most, or without stable guardianship. So I think that's like the first, to address the first half of that question of, young people are actually excluded from this conversation despite these policies being targeted for them. And in these same, in these practices and policies, the platforms would ultimately, like Cynthia mentions, would encroach on, young people from accessing, not, they market it as, it's going to prevent them from accessing quote unquote adult content. But as we've seen, the definition and the growth of what that could include, it tends to sweep up, topics on sex education or mental health resources, reproductive health, and so much more. And that sort of content is relatively important, given that the states who have implemented some of these laws, those schools fail to provide comprehensive sex education, or young people accessing that content may not have family environments that are as supportive or affirming of their identities that Cynthia mentioned. So, and then, diving deeper into gender affirming and reproductive health care, we've seen across the United States in particular of both forms of care being banned or criminalized. And if you're prompted to show ID or some sort of age verification system in place, accessing that information is more dangerous than ever, given the direct, pipeline into your information that could harm you very, very directly, and could punish you from even searching or wanting to access that sort of information. So I think treads into a very scary pipeline of broader censorship of anything that challenges current political or cultural narratives. So I think it starts with the lack of young people not being in those sort of policy and decision-making rooms and being excluded from those conversations, despite, all of these policies targeting us.
Yeah, that's such a great point. And it's kind of unfortunate disappointment that I had a colleague recently actually say this saying that I heard for the first time, but that the closer you are to the problem, the closer you are to the solution. And it's unfortunate that lawmakers have not taken the advantage of including young people in these conversations and thinking of solutions or how to how to talk about these issues. But I'd love to also talk to you a little bit about, like, from a technologist perspective, how are young people already experiencing this increased surveillance and censorship online, like especially around topics like Palestine or immigration and other issues? How do age verification and the related technologies amplify those harms and protect young users?
Yeah, I'll focus in on around like social media when it comes to conversations on Palestine and immigration. At Gen Z for Change, a big, core of our work is educating our young audience on core issues that affect us and working with, content creators and influencers to educate their audiences. And time again, we've seen, especially with Palestine related content, posts are being shadow banned, accounts are being removed or blocked very unduly, and almost like no like content and views around particular subjects were being shadow banned. And so so that's like the first aspect to social media when it comes to already like politically charged conversations. And then if you're adding age verification or any sort of like identity tracking technology on this environment, like specifically if it could be biometric data or anything adjacent, it could be, like I mentioned earlier,
I think we lost you, Hannah. Yeah. Well,
there's a lot to unpack, I think, when it comes to censorship already existing on social media, but then adding in, like I mentioned, one layer of age verification seems to just continuously heighten the sort of harms associated. And I bring this up because the current Trump administration in the United States has highlighted that social media activity and monitoring is a big step when it comes to identifying people to penalize and deport and things like that. And so seeing that firsthand, it's a little scary because as it relates to self-censoring and how we're approaching the internet, and how we're not just allowing these algorithms to define our experience online, but add in sort of state sanctioned punishment and fear around it together really changes our experience online.
Yeah, for sure. The chilling effect is very real on how people experience the internet now. That's such a great point. One of the ways that age verification is done, one of the main ways, is through government IDs, and through, you take a photo of your government ID, or also there has been a lot of talk around digital IDs and those schemes and how they can integrate with age verification. And Cynthia and Alexis, you both have worked quite extensively on the move towards digital IDs and digital wallets. And Alexis, I'd love to go to you first. From a technical perspective, how tightly do you see age verification schemes being now coupled with the broader digital ID system? And we've seen governments fast track digital ID by tying it to age verification. So how does that compare to earlier iterations of digital ID that you've worked on, and where are you seeing the most concerning scope creep there?
Sure. So at the first iteration of digital ID, probably well over 10 years ago, it was more so focused on national databases around biometric data in particular. You had fingerprint collection, you had other types of biometric data that could possibly be stored on a national level, and centralizing the ID of people within a certain context of a country. So you'll have, like, India is the most, I would say, reputable example of all of this, of the old guard digital identity. They've had several incidents since then of merging everyone's data together like that into a national database, health data, and then other types of data that could be potentially conflated with your national ID. And so even today, we still see remnants of that in proposals around national ID and merging that with biometric data. Then came the pandemic, and everybody wanted to go digital. Everybody wanted to make sure that they are able to have some sort of credentials on the device of being able to display a certain kind of credential. During that time, it was verifying that you had a vaccination. And that was contentious for various reasons, because a lot of the technology that was being deployed then wasn't necessarily being pushed by public health officials. It wasn't considered helpful by public health officials to have necessarily a verified vaccine credential on your device in order to help public health. They were asking for things like PPE and more expanded healthcare systems, but not necessarily a QR code to get into a building, whether or not you had a vaccine or not. But a lot of the players from that time have since then pivoted and saw the benefit of becoming a wallet, or an all-encompassing ID wallet or digital wallet. So those players from that era and that time shifted, pivoted, and decided to promote themselves on device credentials, right? So having device bound credentials. And device bound can mean different things now in age verification land. A lot of people have various proposals around what that looks like, but with digital ID in particular, what became popular, at least in the US context, especially, is mobile driver's licenses. So mobile driver's licenses started to roll out in each state for various reasons. It was at first pushed through mechanisms like TSA. I believe the only institution right now accepting mobile driver's licenses wholesale is TSA. And even their technology to accept MDLs are varied airport to airport, depending on what technology they have deployed there. But the MDL sort of is an example of a device-bound credential. So if you lose that phone, you lose that mobile driver's license, and you have to reprovision it with the whatever DMV that you have gotten your original license from, right? So at first there was like a slow momentum towards it. There was like adoption, and Apple and Google became on board. Some states had different implementations. The oldest implementation, I believe, is Louisiana. They had around like 2016 to 2017, they implemented their mobile driver's license, and they've had several fiascos since then. But I do believe they started pushing even their iteration towards what we see today with Apple and Google Wallet and provisioning a driver's license to that. So that became the framework in the US context for a digital ID on device in your wallet. And there's different arguments around how safe or secure that is. Generally, it's treated as a secure context on your phone. So that way it's not shared across cloud services, but digital ID being shared online, that's a different story. So we were pivoting, we're expanding the scope of what that means. And that's where age verification became very pointed as a topic to propel as a catalyst to keep promoting digital ID and sharing that online is a very new context. I pull out my ID in the US, I'm not sure how many times a month, probably I can count on one hand. And you would possibly purchase alcohol, cigarettes, pick up your prescription medication. So at most a couple times a month. But with this new scheme of digital ID and age verification, that goes from maybe showing your ID once or twice to frequently turning everyone online into a verifier, and looking at that scope and looking at that amount of data sharing, there's different ways that different players have decided to say, oh, this is secure, don't worry. We've found secure, cryptographically fancy ways to share your age online. So not necessarily the ID itself, but just the age threshold. And people will talk about it in a more private context that way. And that is true, there's ways to do that, but there's still this expanded scope that exists. Sharing your ID online is completely different than me showing my ID to my pharmacist. And a lot of proponents tend to glaze over that and ignore the expanded scope and the fact that it's burdening the entire public to be able to browse the web online and use it as we do today. So that part of digital ID we have definitely seen get rushed. There's a couple of like standards and everything that have gotten rushed. Implementation has been rushed. So in order to satisfy age verification requirements.
Yeah. That is really I think a point that I just started thinking about is I feel like no matter how secure and private these technologies end up being, there is a creepy sense of it, of like giving your ID to Twitter or Facebook, or even worse, uploading a scan of your ID every time you go to watch porn. And I think that's why a really, I think, interesting stat came out when Louisiana implemented their age verification law. They were one of the first states to implement that law. They 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 had Pornhub implement the LA license, way to prove your identity, and they saw an 80% decrease in traffic to their site because people realized that that's weird and creepy, and I don't want to upload my ID to see that content. And it makes you wonder of like, where did those people go to find that content that they were looking for? And yeah, it's just interesting that no matter how private and secure and yeah, the vendors, all their talking points will still, there's still that deep down creepy feeling of showing your ID multiple times a day, multiple times a week. But I'd love to talk about the vendors with you, Cynthia, a little bit. You've written and you've spoken about how digital ID systems have been promoted by tech vendors and state governments as a convenient and a necessary solution for accessing both private and more recently public services. So as government roll out digital ID and age verification schemes, we're also seeing this growing ecosystem of vendors and even more third parties handling all of that sensitive data. What concerns you the most about how this data is, contracted, controlled, reused, shared, sold, especially when accountability is fragmented across so many private and public actors?
Yes, my number one concern is exactly as Alexa said, the relationship that we all have to the public documentation that validates and verifies our identity is drastically changing when it is digitized. And yet it is still being discussed and explained to members of the public as if it was merely the equivalent of taking like a photograph of your physical ID and having, like it bookmarked on an app in your phone. And the infrastructure that is required in order to verify your identity, that collects your identifying credentials, that collects the verifier's credentials, that connects those two in the moment in time you are showing them, the infrastructure that requires, and by the way, the amount of information that is collected and stored and potentially exposed as a result are not parts of the conversation. And the way that the public is left out of the very drastic change that we will all experience as our identities, as our driver's licenses, for example, are fundamentally changed. All these changes are happening not in public forums. Very few state legislators have actually taken up the challenges of really thinking through what it means to digitize our identity and how that changes our relationship to government, how it is at the same time that we are all becoming aware of how commercial data brokers have exposed and made our vast amounts of location data and financial transaction data and communications data more accessible to more people at the same time that we're becoming aware of the commercial threat. And legislation is, bubbling around about privacy in regards to how private vendors must regard our data. The government is building the plumbing to collect it directly itself. And I think that the disconnect between our awareness of the commercial threat and the willingness to let the same commercial vendors be government vendors who are creating the exact or very similar kinds of infrastructure with without the regulation, without public participation, without public debate. And rather, this is all happening inside of very opaque procurement processes that happen in government that is very difficult for the public to be engaged in. It's nearly impossible sometimes to learn about how these procurement projects are initiated. Our organization was founded as the New York City Municipal ID was in the midst of an RFP for digitization. And our founder was engaged in a lot of the original conversations around the creation of the municipal ID, which was called for by a lot of immigrant communities, by homeless communities, by people who were needing an additional type of identity. But under the Blasio administration, a project was initiated that invited corporate vendors to propose, digitization process for this municipal ID. We only found out about that process through the news because the opacity surrounding procurement really prevented public engagement. Now, once the coalition that fought for the municipal ID was engaged and was aware, you can read about it on our website, the campaign that it involved. We did successfully push back against that digitization, preserved the ability of New Yorkers to purchase, for example, transit rides with cash. And we have continued to really pay attention to the way that very quiet projects of government procurement are excluding and erasing public debate around these digital public infrastructure projects that will fundamentally change how we relate to each other and the government, but without the kind of democratic public participation that we might expect.
Oh no, Rin, you're muted.
Sorry. That's a great point. And I think that you mentioned the irony there, how lawmakers a lot argue that platforms can't be trusted to keep kids safe, but those are the same vendors that governments are in bed and relying on the same tech companies and vendors to verify everyone's identities. And I find that really interesting. And Alexis, from your vantage point, does this actually improve security or trust, having vendors be the same tech companies, or does it just multiply the number of systems that can fail?
Yeah, so when you look at what Cynthia was talking about, like that procurement process, a lot of that does go without a lot of public transparency. And I think that's one of the biggest issues, that a lot of that public civic process doesn't get involved early enough. And then it gets implemented, a vendor is already chosen. And then a pilot comes out with a potential vendor in mind. So what ends up happening here is I've seen in the age verification space where a lot of the same platforms that are being penned as harmful towards children, a lot of that is being pivoted towards still looking at big tech vendors to implement some sort of form of age verification, as well as other companies and players as well. There's different standards involved. I won't get into too many details around that, but there's different standards and implementations around age verification that we have seen, and some can be ranked better than others in terms of how private it can and can't be, right? Sharing a zero knowledge proof of my age is better than uploading my ID image wholesale. And so different age vendors and age verification methods have been able to incorporate whatever this process looks like. They often have multiple methods with one vendor, usually a liveliness check, facial estimation potentially, and then possibly relying on your digital ID. That could be like one implementation from one vendor. So the vendor is usually coming in with already a set amount of narratives of what works, and the public doesn't get to debate that. And so that breaks down trust when you have that, and you have to like retroactively look at these things. And then you have it where creating a safer, more private web isn't necessarily the goal of age verification when it's getting implemented. And you have it where it's easier to implement and see age verification from a lot of platforms' perspective than it is to actually create a safer, better web. It's an easy win from their perspective. it's saying, look, we're doing something. So for instance, you will have an open initiative where, Google has presented a library to implement zero knowledge proofs in the European digital wallet implementation, right? But Google also has a large track record of other types of practices on the web that's been largely privacy violating and revenue conflicts and business conflicts on keeping people private online. Look at the track record with Chrome. They have many enhancements over the years, but then when it comes to the conversation of privacy, things got rolled back. Things had to be negotiated in terms of like cookies and third-party cookies, sharing, tracking people online, the Google Ads ecosystem, and the problems that came with that. But now they get to say, like, look, we are sharing this library. It's open source, and we're implementing age verification. We're making a better web. And they can sort of have this reputation building aspect where you can now say that you have tried to do something to keep people safe, rather than focusing on other aspects of keeping people safe online, is making it more private for everyone and doing something about corporate surveillance online. So with that said, a lot of this is not necessarily keeping children's data safer. That's not a feature of age verification. It doesn't really teach them how to be safe online. Kids will be online. How do they go about that? And how do they do that safely? Age verification doesn't really address that at all either. And then you'll have an expanded scope of data and sharing frequency. So there will be people that will say this method is more private than that method, or there's another initiative called Age Keys. I've noticed that's being adopted recently by Meta and other major partners, right? And a lot of people are coming to me and say, look, we have better, safer technology. And I'm like, that's great that there's technologists actually working on safer aspects of sharing age online. But to me, there's still core issues and problems around core narratives about keeping kids actually safe that I'm seeing that get skipped over for the sake of saying that we did a thing, and we solved it. Everybody go home. We have zero knowledge proofs. Everybody go home. We solved it, everyone. And it's kind of like, no, this is a new system being burdened onto the public still. We still need to talk about the scope, mandatory age checks, and the fact that it's taking the ability to be flexible online and anonymous online, taking that key pillar that EFF has fought for, anonymity online. And now that's being treated as a bad thing. You can't be anonymous online anymore. You need to have it tied or bound to a real world aspect of yourself as you go online, and not seeing that as being renegotiated, in a sense that anonymity is now being traded off for terms like pseudo anonymity, right? So you'll have that being taken away. And to me, that doesn't necessarily make things safer when you're sharing more of yourself online. I love, as someone who works in public key cryptography, I love the aspect of zero knowledge proofs, and I like seeing innovation like that. But the fact that I'm seeing like these innovations being used to share more about myself online, I find a lot of irony behind that, as someone excited about these technologies at its core, but I'm not excited about it being implemented in the age verification space. And that's what it's being promoted and used for, and not necessarily about sharing less about yourself online and being safer online, but sharing more about myself and more frequently online,
Yeah.
just because there's a safe way to do it.
Right.
Yeah.
And the other irony of also how most of us growing up as children were told to not talk to strangers online, not to share your personal information online, and the ways that now age verification mandates will desensitize a whole, generation of people who think it's normal to put your ID online, and the ways in which scamming will be even easier, and being able to get people's information just because you're so used to giving up all of that information at every point of your internet experience. That's such a interesting irony. And just quickly, Alexis, you mentioned zero knowledge proofs. For folks who don't know what those are, can you give a quick explanation?
Yeah, sure. Sorry about that. I try to stay away from jargon, but basically, zero knowledge proofs are a cryptographic way of sharing. So using math to share your age threshold in this context of age verification, sharing something without revealing the source. So the source has been privately created, and then I get to privately share some information with you without sharing the core of that information with you. It's been verified in that sense, cryptographically. So I get to share with you that I'm over the age of 21 without necessarily revealing my birth date in this context. Zero knowledge proofs are considered sound, and it has a lot of research behind it. And I am glad to see more development behind it. But that is what that means in this context of age verification is I'm able to share that a verified piece of information about myself without revealing said information.
Super helpful, thank you. And for folks who want to learn more about all of these technologies and how different they are, how similar they are, we do have a lot of breakdowns in our age verification hub, which you can visit at eff.org/age, AGE. I'd love to switch a little bit back to you, Hannah, about reactions and responses to age verification and these online safety laws. How are young people, especially Gen Z, responding to these laws? And do you see more support, opposition, or skepticism compared to older people? And what do you think lawmakers are consistently misunderstanding about how young people experience the internet?
Yeah, I think young people's responses definitely vary. I will say, of course, like, we don't have one, monolithic understanding of it, but I would say, some young people's focus around these policies could be described as very like cautious and skeptical, like you mentioned, especially compared to the older generations. I say this because I think young people have firsthand seen how online harm is real. We deal with scams, harassment, and exploitative platform design every day. But that's not exclusive or limited to young people in Gen Z, right? Every demographic that's online faces scams and harassment as well, and use platforms with poor design practices. So there is a support for safety measures, and I think that's where young people can see the harms of some of these platforms. But then there's a skepticism when the solution ends up, focusing more on surveillance and data collection rather than, centering the actual safety that kind of interests us in the first place. And I think how lawmakers often misunderstand that reality, like I mentioned earlier, when they're not talking to young people, when they're not consulting them, and when they're not, doing due diligence across, the board of young people in foster systems and queer youth and everyone in between. They often, lawmakers aren't able to process that the internet still serves as an interconnected space for learning and organizing and finding community and mental health resources and accessing critical information for our everyday on social media. I often tell my older family members that for us, like TikTok and Instagram are how we watch the news. We often get a lot of our learning of everyday reality from, those directly reporting on the ground. And so when that sort of option is almost taken away or heavily surveilled, lawmakers, clearly have a big gap to fill there. And then I would say that one of the through lines, though, through a lot of these conversations and observations have been to hold some of these platforms accountable. We want transparency around our experience. The algorithms are always changing, like I mentioned, and so stronger protection against particular scams and how our data is being used and the consequences that come from misusing that, if anything, is what we or what some Gen Z folks would want more transparency on, and so or young people would want transparency on. So I think age verification, like Alexis and mentioned, often takes responsibility away from the social media and big tech platforms, and then like Cynthia mentioned as well, and then they're the same ones implementing these sort of data heavy solutions that are make us uncomfortable. And, we've used the word creepy a lot in our conversation today, but it really is that reality. So those are some of the gaps I've seen. I think from a young person's perspective, there's a lot to consider, both on our experience, online, but also what some of these new policies could do, not just for our experience, but for our data double and what they're using there.
Yeah, such a great point. To wrap us up, I also want to ask you, Cynthia and Alexis, both of you come to this work not only as experts in the issue, but also as parents of young people. So when the state's answer to parenting online is surveillance and restriction, what alternatives do you think actually work? What tools, practices, or values can parents rely on instead of age verification mandates? I'll go Cynthia.
We're all navigating rather hostile landscapes online, and it, I think, prepares young people more for this world to have thorough, ongoing, complicated conversations about what it means to be discerning in this world, to understand the motives of different sources, to understand how to research what the source material is and understand it inside of context. I think so much of the information that is delivered to us, whether it is appearing as news on an Instagram feed, or whether it is what we are searching a large browser for and getting under what is called a news category, regardless of where we are, we have to understand that the groups that are self-identifying as news giving are not always without motives that make their reporting less truthful. And so I think that what I try to do, what I think is most helpful to prepare young people for this world, is to sharpen their tools of discernment so that they can understand how something like age verification, for example, is not, as Alexis and Hannah said, protecting them as much as it is yet another failure of us all to really force tech companies to make more responsible decisions on behalf of all of us about how unhealthy, about how driven to keep scrolling, about how absolutely free for all our data is. And rather than address how this impacts all of us, another aspect of age verification laws that I have a problem with is how it really just takes the smallest possible bite and has the impact of erasing young people's social network, of erasing what might be a community of support in a place where they don't have access to a lot of supportive people. It has the impact, if anyone has ever deleted, your just for example, Twitter account and lost all those contacts that you only had, or you lost your history of what was maybe like your daily journal. Young people in Australia who have lost access to social media overnight lost access to communities that were supporting them, in addition to perhaps a few that were protected from a harmful community. But it is, I think, not being weighed fairly in regards to young people's futures, as much as it is being driven by companies as a way to make the smallest type of regulation that will have as little of an impact on their bottom line as possible.
Great point. Alexis?
Yes, and to kind of reflect into that, keeping in considering the environment around children and considering something that's closer to them and the institutions and help that they have closer to them is probably a better strategy than using techno-solutionism. Techno-solutionism is not a parenting strategy in my eyes. And it's like she said, a very small bite of a really complex issue. There's children going through different various abuses or dangers, or even having, like, at minimum, corporate surveillance being normalized in their life. I feel bad for kids these days. They're being told that they can't use their phones at school and having phone bans, but then the school hands them a surveillance riddled laptop full of spyware essentially. And it's an issue. There was another teenager recently, he spoke at DEF CON last year about how he found a vape detection device in his school and broke that down with another hacker out in the Portland area. And the device came with its own issues and vulnerabilities and problems. And seeing these technologies being deployed in school and seeing technologies being forced onto kids without much conversation with the parents just get a notification. It happened to me. Hey, we're using this app for a daycare. And that actually spiraled into me having to investigate the privacy of daycare applications. So it's very much so an issue where kids are being told that corporate surveillance is okay, violating your privacy is okay, but we're keeping you safe by kicking you all off these platforms and keeping you away from the bits of information that you can have online. I think also nothing can replace a conversation with your children. My 6-year-old knows why she can't browse YouTube by herself, and she can articulate that back to me. And if a 6-year-old can do that and understand that with me, I think people can go the extra mile just a little bit and have that conversation with their older children who are online, right, and have devices. And it has to take a community effect here to actually impact the safety of children in their everyday life and online. So we can't forget about in real life with children. And I think this techno-solutionism aspect of age verification takes the route that blocking and censorship and excluding them offline and treating the internet as if it's just TikTok. And a lot of it takes advantage of parental fears around social media and all the things that can possibly come with it, gaming platforms. And it boils it down to the internet is not just TikTok. The internet is a great place, and it can be, has a lot of information on it that's useful. There's a lot wrong right now, thanks to different corporate entities, but those are things that need to be solved in different ways, not through age verification. It doesn't do anything about any of those problems, right? So it's a very small portion of what is wrong, and it addresses it in a way that burdens us all with having to find some way to be able to use the internet freely and access lawful content freely. So I do believe that if parents are afraid about their children being online and have those concerns, there should be some sort of way of being able to address that. And parental tools exist. Parental controls exist, and there's plenty of them. There was a study out that not a lot of parents actually utilize these tools due to maybe usability issues and such. And I do believe that if you take the moment to go with the revamped tooling that I've seen from like Apple or Google for like children's accounts and such, that you'll be able to see that some of the tools that you're asking for, such as out of New York, they were asking for, what was it, no notifications at night or something like that as a mandate in the bill. That exists already. It's called Do Not Disturb. It's called bedtime mode. There's different, you don't have to legislate this. You don't have to redo this. This exists. The technology exists. And I think a lot of parents aren't aware of that. And I think education awareness with parents and technology, rather than just forcing technology on people in the framework of how you feel technology should be used, is the education aspect is way more useful than and nurturing aspect is way more useful than authoritarianism and age verification mandates.
Yeah, those are great points. And we're going to move to audience questions now. And there was one question that's actually relevant to what we're talking about now from SF Dad 2501. They asked, I'd love to hear some tips or recommendations for interacting with other parents of middle schoolers on this topic. I hear a lot of my peers cheering at the passage of age gating legislation because they want to prevent their own kids from accessing social media, for example. In conversation, I've tried pointing out that the current implementation of these laws have a lot of unintended consequences. That is, it won't just affect your kids. With the goal of changing minds, or at least encouraging folks to think more deeply about the problem, what else can I do in this situation? I think, Alexis, you just brought up a lot of great points on what to say in response about how the internet can be a source of good, and there's a lot of good in the information that young people can access online. Anything else that folks want to add on to SFDAD?
I would add, look at the ways that there's for all of us, there are efforts to push us all onto digital identification, and age is only one of them. There was just an effort defeated in Britain this past week, where there was a government push for workers in order to work to have digital ID that affirms their immigration status. So we can see the creep. To go back to the word that seems to be the word cloud theme of this conversation, the expansion of the logic from age gating to immigration status gauging is potentially expansive. And when we're living in a country where our vice president is openly socializing and citing to people who believe that women have the intellectual capacity as children, we can imagine that it is only a matter of time before gender gating is also something that is imagined, if not also pushed for the purpose of legislating other people's morality. So I would add to everything Alexis said, which I think are all really grounded and excellent points to bring up with parents, that this is not just about protecting young people. It's about protecting us all, and really thinking about young people as people invested in learning from the internet, and having parents be sort of co-learners as we're all trying to navigate an environment with news that we have to think more deeply about its sources from, as we all have to think a little bit more about why we're being shown something. Giving kids the tools to sort of add that critical thinking to their daily life and to our daily lives is, I think, what will help us all.
Yeah, these are great points. Hannah, anything to? I know you're not a parent, but
I mean, I can add one. I'll add a line of to reaffirm what Cynthia and Alexis have said, that it's gonna expand way faster than we think once some of these policies take a shape that maybe parents may initially like, and then the rest will snowball into something that we've seen time and time again with other sort of norms and policies. So yeah, I think part of me is like, oh, do we need to reteach parents about the surveillance state? And the answer might be yes, but not sure we all have time for that completely.
Yeah. Frisky Goat asks, if I run a personal non-commercial blog website with some adult content, but the website is not focused around it, how would I comply with such age check regulation? I do not have money for proprietary checkers, nor I want to violate visitors' privacy. Feels like bigger platforms have a monopoly and indie websites have to censor/close. I think you're correct, Frisky Goat. Our colleague Molly Buckley wrote a great piece on this that we'll drop in the chat, titled why age verification is a windfall for big tech and a death sentence for smaller platforms. Smaller platforms that won't be able to afford these checkers are going to be forced to shut down and create even bigger monopolies around social media platforms. So you're spot on. But does everyone else have responses to Frisky Goat? Well, last question I think we have time for is from Irumia. And their question is, how can we push back? And how can we keep age verification data from being leaked and stolen? The second one I fear is out of all of our control. But if anyone has thoughts on that, feel free to opine. But the bigger question of how can we push back, I'd love to hear from everyone as a parting note. We can start with you, Cynthia. Here.
Sure. I mean, as many ways as we all can, I think, use our physical IDs, choose the checkout line that has a person you can interact with, in as many ways as you can when you're given the options to use cash, to use your physical card, to use a checkout line that has a clerk that, I don't know, you might have a cute moment with. Who knows? It's not, the idea that interacting with each other or showing your ID to someone at the pharmacy, perhaps for the first time, but not having to do it again for the second or third time because you are known. Sort of thinking about the ways that that community interaction and the community fluidity that we have with each other is itself a protection that we can lean on and hold each other more accountable than we can hold a big tech company accountable. So part of what our calls in our, if you look at our link that I shared or that was shared earlier, thank you. Part of our demands are just using physical cards more, resisting the push to, download that mobile driver's license. And then also when it comes to policy, being engaged, understanding why it's important that local businesses allow you to pay and accept cash. Understanding how having the physical versions of everything, of having the ability to call an agency and find a person on the phone, of being able to go down to an agency and find someone that you can speak to one-on-one, of really insisting that while we have a lot of digital conveniences, that every single opportunity we have as the public to directly interact with our government and to participate in the development of policy, we have to take before it's taken away.
I'd love to add on to that. I noticed in the chat, we got a message from an Iowa senator saying, contact and educate their legislator on the issue. Legislators are scared to vote against it because they'll be accused of showing adult content to kids. And so I always am urging young people to, get involved in the legislative and advocacy process as early as possible, but also, holding these big tech or companies accountable for your, experience online. And I agree with Cynthia that the more, using cash and your card in person over, tap and pay or anything similar to that, is always the move. If you're in a big city, I'm also in just a general surveillance kind of practice of wearing your mask on public transit or just generally, not just to keep yourself safe, health wise. There's so many, I guess, like benefits to, when you're kind of working to protect yourself, there's so many additional benefits that come with that. Yeah.
Alexis?
Yeah. So my answer probably is a little bit more nebulous and esoteric, but I do try to at least talk about pushing back against like some of these core narratives that are inciting public fear about children online. There are actual valid studies about what harms actually come to children when they are online and how you can address them. And I think approaching and pushing these more well-founded studies and aspects of what can be considered harm is something that can be promoted, something that can be done in conversation. One of the biggest examples that I've seen with like age verification and sensationalism around children and harm online is a Brazilian law that just went into effect for age verification. And I had to find a great irony in that they were talking about how children are being exploited online for various reasons, engaging in adult acts, and the entire public the public catalyst was a YouTube video by an influencer who is not a child care expert, who is not a child endangerment expert, who is not a child exploitation expert, but just an influencer online that made, I think, about a 40-minute video and incited the public to do something about it with age verification. I had to take a moment of the irony of adults being manipulated by online content while saying that children are being manipulated by online interactions. And I have to take a pause and say, like, you as an adult, what are you doing and reacting to when it comes to keeping children safe online? And challenging that narrative overall is something that I think that we can definitely do with all of ourselves, have some sort of introspection, and being able to have those conversations. A lot of people are scared because of a lot of different types of FUD content that are happening and promoting that children online are coming with these like exploitative dangers, and then some of these dangers are not in grounded theory and they're not in grounded actions or evidence. And so if you're reacting to a influencer's video about children online, I have to question whether or not that this is the best approach. So now we have to deal with the law, and now we have to deal with like these implementations. And you can do things like look at these implementations, like what implementations happening in your area of the world, and what vendors are being involved, challenging those vendors, challenging that aspect of. There was something that one of our colleagues said recently at EFF that I thought was very, very poignant. Was she said that there's politics of procurement, and Cynthia had spoke to that earlier, and getting involved in those politics actually is very impactful when you look at how governments are procuring these vendors for age verification. A lot of the age verification methods like age estimation, age inference, have a lot of databases involved that actually reward a lot of data brokers for the years and years and years of privacy violating practices that they have done for us. And now they are contracting them to do age estimation and age inference on various people's accounts. We need to track these things. And the more that you do that and bring attention to the actual harms being done and the actual practices that are in play, I do believe that pushing back against some of this narrative that we're seeing also helps. It's not as concrete of an action, but I do think it's something to poke at the public zeitgeist a little bit when it comes to age verification.
Yeah, no, all great points. And I'll just add, I work on state legislation, so I wouldn't be me if I didn't co-sign Hannah's point about reaching out to your legislators. A lot of these bills are being considered actively in state houses and in Congress. So, as I mentioned, there was 19 bills being taken up about so-called kids safety online, and everyone has, if you're in the US, you have a congressperson you can reach out to. And if you haven't checked out our age verification hub either, unfortunately, this is these will be the only questions we have time for, but our age verification hub might have answers to most of your questions. So please do check it out. We also have a page on how you can help us fight back with certain links for actions and whatnot. But thank you. I want to first thank Alexis, Cynthia, and Hannah for joining us today. And thank you to everyone who contributed to the discussion in the chat, for the great questions, and everyone for watching around the world. Digital rights begin with you. EFF has been a leader in privacy, freedom of expression, and innovation for 35 years, and we need your help to keep the fight. Become a member today at EFF.org/support-change, and we hope you will continue these conversations about your civil liberties with your colleagues and your friends and your family. Please be sure to mark your calendars for the next segment of Effecting Change on Thursday, February 19th, 2026, where we will be talking about license plate readers and their impact on local communities. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.